I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite and president of Venable Park Investment Council Incorporated. Welcome to the show, Danielle.
Hello, Jim.
Canadian real estate, Toronto and Vancouver, of course, we're seeing insane prices. The rest of Canada, soft. Calgary and Edmonton, of course, disaster because of the oil patch. Yet we're still being told REITs can still be a good investment. I guess it's the old location.
I'm pretty skeptical, I must say. I've looked at the numbers a lot on the valuations. There's been a hell of a good run here in REITs in terms of price appreciation in the past few years since the QE stuff lowered rates in general, in the safer stuff, and this sort of belief that you can't go wrong with real estate in Canada. So, if you look at the sectors that REITs typically invest in, they've had a huge influx of investment capital, a lot of money chasing yield. That's come in just as valuations have been the most obscene in, several decades, just as the oversupply has been peaking. And that goes across the board, right from rental properties, where you've seen a huge focus of investment dollars going into making multi-unit residential buildings. That it goes for condos, that goes for the retail space that goes along with typically those type of residential projects. And you see, across the board now, retail sales are faltering. The ability of regular families in Canada to just purchase housing is at the lowest it's been in many decades as well, notwithstanding really low interest rates. Just the price has got so large relative to household spending capacity or income that they're basically unaffordable. So I'm quite concerned that there's a lot of risk baked into real estate investment trusts. And when you get, and that's nothing to say about rising rates, which is a whole other, risk that comes down the road when rates begin to rise from these, once in a lifetime lows. So even without any upward pressure in rates, even assuming Canada has a weak patch here for a while longer and there's no sort of inflationary impacts, I think that you're going to find it difficult to sustain the valuations in those quote investments. The other thing is, of course, Jim, we continue to see this massive exodus of capital fleeing a crumbling Chinese banking system and a slowing economy. And the growth rates just continue to trend lower. And as China, sort of rushes to try and figure out ways to devalue its currency, you have a lot more people trying to get whatever, savings they have out of the country and diversify it into other assets. And that's what we've seen, of course, in hotspots like Toronto and Vancouver, which, at some point is unsustainable in itself because there's only so much capital that can be moved. It's unproductive capital because it's not necessarily for, people to actually utilize. It's not even for people to actually generate positive income flow from it. Again, because they're overpaying for the asset, because there's a lot of properties available for rent, many of these properties are just sitting completely empty and unproductive. So it's really negative carry when it comes to, a place to put money. And, although, while prices are going up, people may justify that and say, oh, well, I'm not worried that it's not paying its bills or that it's causing negative cash flow, or I'm not worried that it's not producing any income because it's going up. But as soon as properties or prices start to plateau or can't go up any further, then you find people are not prepared to continue eroding their own income from other sources in order to sustain those properties. And I think that's when you see a bunch of people wanting to sell at once and then the whole cascading effect of that.
Of course, people in Vancouver are wondering, do I sell now, take that big hunk of money and rent? How do people make a decision on that right now?
Well, it's, obviously I always go back to what's your time frame. Are you actually living in the house? Do you love living there? Can you afford to keep it? Is it something you can see yourself staying in over the next 10 years and being able to afford and maintain over the next 10 years? If the answer to that is yes, then I think, you decide, it might be, a quote, financially intelligent to sell and move somewhere else, but, in the big picture, I'm content staying here. This is my family home, that sort of thing. But when the logic is, no, I wouldn't keep this property if values started to go down, or I wouldn't keep this property if, some of my other financial assets took a hit, or I wouldn't be able to maintain this property if my income dropped. If those are the kind of, facts that support the question about whether or not you should be holding on to real estate at this point, if it was meant as a speculation, if it was meant as a property you're hoping to flip. Like I say, if cash flow isn't paying the costs of it as a, quote, investment, then I think those all should be considered reasons to sell into strength wherever possible. I saw some story, was it this week or last week, where a property in Vancouver went for $1 million over the asking price, right? So we're in Looney Tunes land here. And, when people win a lottery, they don't sit there and question whether they should cash the ticket in, right? They just take the cash and go happily. But when it comes to real estate or rising assets in bubble phases, people are often, they won the lottery, but they don't want to cash the ticket. Well, eventually, that looks after itself typically, where speculative episodes have prices decline quickly, and then you're left where you can't cash that ticket. So, I think the other thing that's very interesting is that the owner equivalent rent, which is a component of the inflation calculations that governments do in North America, is likely to trend lower because we've had this huge increase in supply of rental accommodation in all over North America. And so again, if there's downward pressure on rents, just as prices are very high, this also makes the metrics or the math less appealing and less affordable to, quote, investors.
We'll have more with Danielle Park right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Unbelievable harmony, spectacular performance, the ultimate tribute to the Everly Brothers and Simon & Garfunkel. Bird Dog and the Vintage Electric Band coming to West Vancouver Friday, May 6th at the K-Meek Center. Buy online and save at ontourtickets.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Danielle Park. Danielle, the International Energy Agency believes that oil production will be pretty well break even by the end of the year, even though we have a massive surplus right now. What does that tell us about crude oil?
Well, we could see, at some point you expect we're going to see some drawdown of the record inventories that are everywhere in the world, whether it be in ground storage, whether it be in the huge, line of tanker ships that is waiting at all the major ports in the world for weeks at a time at sea, trying to get in with their cargo. At some point, you expect that there'll be a drawdown. The problem is that at this point they continue to increase the output, or even if they agree at this, there's not a lot of hope about this meeting of the major world oil producers coming up on Saturday, and a lot of people have been hoping that they'll come to some consensus about capping production and that's being pumped out. But there's two things about that. One, in January they were actually producing at all-time highs. The two major producers in the world, in particular, Russia and Saudi Arabia, were at pretty much record volumes of production. And so if they're talking about capping it anywhere here, that's already at much higher levels than has been the case historically. At the same time, you have places like the IMF and other OECD bodies all lowering their growth expectations for the world economy looking over the next year. So these are moving targets, right? On the one hand, you have trying to guess where world demand will be. We know that production is quite a bit above where world demand is at present, but we're not sure where world demand will be over the next year or two. And the trend is certainly down from here. So it's really two moving parts, and it's very hard to figure out when equilibrium will come. But there's also this other piece of every time they come to an agreement, even if they do, amongst producers, like Iraq and Russia and these countries, Venezuela, they are so cash strapped right now that they are very likely to produce more than they even agree to. And that's always been the complexity, right, is that this game of poker where everyone says they're going to hold their targets, and then, of course, there's cheaters left and right. And so you continue to see this increase in supply, even if they agree there won't be. So at this point, it's very hard for me to see a very bullish take on the price of oil. I think, you could see, for example, some further appreciation in the yen, weakness in the U.S. dollar, which has been sort of a trading opportunity where oil has bounced back from, the $28 barrel it hit for WTI. But we're right back sort of at resistance here. We're right back at the 09 kind of low territory around 40 a barrel. And again, it's likely that will prove to be upside resistance for some time here. And barring some unforeseeable event or shock or something that might convince people otherwise, it seems to me that it's more likely 40 is going to be about the upside in that range for some time. And in fact, another surprise to the downside on global growth, whether it be from China or whether it be, about the U.S. economy, which is faltering, you could see significant weakness again in the price of oil.
What about the players like Iran who say we won't go along with anybody's plan to cut back because we were cut back due to sanctions for so long, we need to produce it?
Well, and they do, right? The problem is there are so many economies in the world, not just emerging markets, but many developed economies that have allowed themselves to become unduly concentrated and dependent upon the production and export of this particular commodity, that they're not diversified, their revenue base is not diversified, and they're in a massive cash crunch at the moment. So Iran can say, you guys have been taking all the cash flow while we were held out, and it's our turn now to try and grab some cash flow, and that's maybe a legitimate argument from their perspective, but it doesn't really change the fact that they're not alone in terms of governments under severe pressure. I mean, look at the Saudis themselves, who they're drawing down their massive reserves at a record clip. They've got something like a $90-odd billion deficit expected just for the calendar year. So, you blow through your cash piles pretty fast, just as China's learning, when the economy goes into a major downturn and you've got very high costs and social programs and spending that you've kind of promised and everyone's used to, but revenue's tanked. So that's where you have to get sort of very aggressive in terms of trying to sell product and also in terms of trying to cut spending and expenses.
China also doesn't like it when people fight for their rights. Apparently, there's been a wave of arrests of lawyers who have stood up for people who, for example, didn't want their homes taken away.
Yeah, there's been a lot of that type of thing happening. Free speech is under attack in the world just as people are trying to protest corrupt regimes everywhere, it seems. So I think, we've never been under any impression that China was anywhere close to a free and open society, or that there were not still ongoing incredible intolerance by the government and human rights abuse, and that's always been the case. We just sort of turned a blind eye while they were making all the sorts of products that we were buying on credit the past sort of decade.
Were the Panama Papers a CIA-led leak?
It's an interesting train of thought, right? And even Bill Gates, I was watching an interview where he said, what surprises him is that there weren't more American names found in the file, so to speak. So the whistleblower that was behind the Switzerland, naming or releasing of names a few years ago, he was being interviewed and saying that, he's quite sure that the CIA was behind it, that they're trying to put pressure on people, countries that are not friends of the U.S., And that seems quite likely. But, the thing that I think is most important to understand in this is that Panama is topical, and the leak in this case came from there. But the rise of these tax evading jurisdictions has been on fire the past sort of 15 years. It goes hand in hand with this, this dichotomy in society between the 0.1% that have been siphoning funds out of the system, and then, wanting to sort of hide or protect or set aside money, whether it be, corrupt actors and criminals, all the way down to just politicians and high-profile people who are trying to, cover up how much they've been enriched in this process, or indeed to avoid tax, which is a whole other part of it. So, the U.S. has become one of the major tax havens as well in this process. You don't need to go all the way to Panama. There are many jurisdictions in the U.S. where, they didn't sign on to other initiatives that the international community took to try and stop this money coming into hiding in different countries. And the U.S. didn't sign on purpose, I think, because I think after the financial crisis, everyone was so desperate for liquidity in their banking systems that they really did deals with the devil all over the world. This included letting the major banks, do every crime and every corrupt act and get away with it and pay fines and continue. That's been the one theme of that. The other theme of that has been taking money from whoever wants to give it to you just to hold it in your banking system and, create services that feed off of that. So again, now I like to say the pitchforks are coming, because while the credit bubble was going up and the working people thought they were getting away with something, they thought they were getting wealthier, they thought they were getting a higher standard of living as the debt bubble went up. And as it's burst and they've realized, hey, I haven't, net income is flat and wages haven't had any decent gain in a couple of decades here, and all I'm left with is a bunch of debt and assets that are deflating. Then they start saying, hey, we've got massive holes in budgets from far and wide here, from private, from governments, from, institutions of every kind are in the red. And now you have that push for everyone to look for revenue and tax dollars and anything and everything they can find to help plug these holes. And I think so this preoccupation or, adrenaline for going after money that's been hiding is not going to go away anytime soon. I think it's going to spread. So people that have been availing themselves of these services must be sweating, I would say, because it's very likely that this is not the last thing we're going to see in terms of leaks of this information.
Well, the government in its new budget did announce that it was going to spend $500 million hiring more auditors to go after tax cheats.
Well, this is, I think, a key issue here. There's two things. First of all, legislation has opted for complexity of regulation rather than efficacy. Simple things like, again, making it simple changes like, for example, dividing investment banking from deposit taking. That's quite simple to do, but instead of not wanting to actually make that major change, they went around the edges and created thousands of pages of legislation. I think the same thing comes for this tax evasion stuff. And one of the second thing about that is that after 9/11, Bill Black talks about this quite clearly on the stats, but after 9/11, many of the best investigators of fraud worldwide, the people who brought down, who were responsible for revealing many of the frauds that happened in 2000 in the tech bubble, the Enrons and the WorldComs and all this, the investigators who were extremely skilled at finding and putting together the cases against these actors were really taken away and put on terrorism. So this, they sort of left the hen house with very few guards on duty, and they've never been put back. So you look at what happened then when we lost all these very experienced investigators who went away from corporate fraud and went to terrorism at the same time. You haven't had any budget to replace that, and I think that's all been quite strategic in a way. So yes, now the next thing is if we're going to be seriously going after this, we have to, cut down the complexity of the legislation and regulation, but we have to reinvigorate the prosecutors and the people that are focused on these crimes by, hiring back many excellent investigators and directing them to this mandate. And there's a lot of law enforcement people who actually enjoy that work and would be very effective at finding that in hand with this incredible whistleblower community, which is quite interested in revealing what they see to be corrupt acts as well. So I think that the capacity to find and to prosecute this is all there. What's been lacking is political will and funding. So if we are into a phase here where we get serious about that again, and I think governments ultimately will, because at the end of the day their budgets are not balancing, right? And the gapping of the expenses way above the revenue here is going to be something that propels them to more interest in this subject. So I think, again, I think we've been through this epic period of tolerance for financial fraud and evasion and all sorts of cheating. And I think we're going into a time which will last for a good many years where the trends will go in the opposite way.
Danielle, thank you very much for chatting with us.
Hey, thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Danielle Park, editor of the popular blog Juggling Dynamite. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. You can forward your questions and comments to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.